Gunther Jikeli has taught courses on anti-Semitism at Indiana University, Potsdam University, and Technical University of Berlin. From 2011 to 2012, he served as an advisor to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, on combating anti-Semitism. In 2013, he was awarded the Raoul Wallenberg Prize for Human Rights and Holocaust Studies by the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation at Tel Aviv University. His latest book, European Muslim Anti-Semitism, Why Young Urban Males Say They Don't Like Jews, was published by Indiana University Press in 2015. And tonight he will be speaking on the rising anti-Semitism in Europe and how to assess the threat. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Jikeli.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we should not do it really formally because we are a small group. And before,
maybe you can move up a little bit.
Yeah, maybe we can. I would like to adapt it really to. We have how long? 1 hour and a half, approximately. Yeah. So I would like to really first know what you want me, what you're interested in, so that I can speak about this and not something what you already know or what you think is not so interesting. So maybe we can just make a round, and I will start with you. What you are interested in.
Well, your knowledge. Your knowledge, because I already know my knowledge.
Okay,
so
but about anti-Semitism in France today and the recent development.
Yes, and what you were saying, why, I'm interested in what's your take. You've studied this, I've seen all that you've taught, so
Okay, all right. Maybe you want to
start? What I would like to show you, I don't know if you have seen this.
Yeah.
We had federal elections here about 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago. There were some art that was it from BDS, and I believe BDS is also quite powerful in the States, in Europe, everywhere.
Yeah.
This has been sitting, I'm sure you've seen it because it was near Concordia, but I heard there were also some near McGill University.
Yes, I've seen that.
And this has been sitting next to the gate of Concordia and in front of the main gate of Concordia for a few weeks. Because I'm not student anymore, so I was passing by. When I saw it, I was shocked. I took a picture.
This is here?
This is here in Montreal.
Can I see it again?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Israël assassine des enfants palestiniens, Harper goes out, Prime Minister here, applaudit, que font les autres partis. Okay? It has been sitting, I don't know how long. I know I've...
Nobody took it off?
No, not only that. I'm sure the Jewish whoever is in charge, okay, they know about it and they try to do something about it, but they say legally they have the right to keep it. Okay. My question was, because I believe you are sitting at McGill, I'm sure I saw a lot of this, I don't know if you've seen it. How come there was no strong protest from the Jewish students or from Jewish professors at McGill and especially at Concordia? Because I believe we're talking about 3,000 easily Jewish students at McGill and Concordia.
And even now
maybe dozens of professors, not hundreds, of Jewish professors.
But it shouldn't only be a Jewish issue, it should be a human rights issue.
So you're
Here are attacking directly to Jews, okay? And I understand what I'm sorry, I can make it later than when to start talking.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're interested in this anti-Zionism and the BDS and also in the response by Jews and non.
My question is, how come it seems that the Jewish community, including the Israeli consulate and so forth, seem completely powerless, or they are not doing any strong thing to start to oppose it? I heard recently, probably know that the two Jewish billionaires, one is what's his name? One is Haim Saban, and
Adelson.
Exactly. They met in the summer, and they said that they were trying to planify something to against it. And that's really my question.
What can be done?
I want to bring up something.
But let's do the round first.
I want to bring up something that relates with this. With the other side, Abigail put one comment slightly negative about Muslims or about something or other, and she was thrown out of the student society. She was denied access to stuff, and it's nothing like this. This is total hate and total lies. She just...
It was the CUTV, the Concordia University TV.
And she didn't get support. It wasn't like,
Well, I could go into it. It's-
yeah, so but I'm just saying the total
Yeah, no, listen,
opposite
no,
is
well,
totally
exactly.
crazy.
My question is, I'm not about the general public, you know, and a lot of general public, I mean, first,
Okay,
they don't follow very much, but especially why Jewish intelligentsia, I'm talking about dozens, if not hundreds, of Jewish professors, historians, philosophers.
I can say something about this. I can
Okay,
surely say
please.
something about this. But maybe we can do the round. But you told me briefly, but maybe you want to say something more. But you said about tribalism you're interested in.
Like the idea that like there's certain groups and that like people belong to these groups before they are like individuals or something.
Yeah. And what would you be interested in?
I'm interested in the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe because I have friends and family that are Jewish, some in Europe and the United States. And I know in France it really is something that the Jewish community really feels strongly, that there is a rise in anti-Semitism. I understand a lot of it comes from a lot of it is French, and it's been there for a long time, and since Dreyfus and before. But there's also a new portion of the population, which is from mostly Arab immigrants, that is also anti-Semitic, and so I was interested in how they link together.
Okay. We're doing the round, but maybe Abigail, you want to add something there?
Let me.
Okay.
So, let me pull my thoughts together.
All right.
I do have a question.
Maybe we're just doing the rounds. What are you interested? Because we're so few, I would like to really speak about what you are interested in. So, what you're interested in to know about?
It looks like some peppers and yeah, it looks vegetarian.
What's happening now, your opinions on it,
try one of each.
I know there's a large fear, or there's a lot of talk about Islamophobia too, that's attention, that's something that you have to consider.
I think maybe Muslims bring it up so that we don't bring up their Jew hatred in their Quran and stuff.
But I
Okay.
think we still have
Alright.
to address something.
Okay, so Abigail, do you want to say something before I start? And Michelle, also maybe want to add something.
Well, just let me think about it.
All right.
Okay. Let me think about it.
Michelle, do you want me to focus on something especially?
No.
Okay. Well, okay. So I kind of get an idea what you're interested in, and please interrupt me whenever you feel, because we should take advantage of it. That we're so few.
Exactly.
It's good.
It's intimate.
Yes. So let me try to give a short summary first, what I think is happening now in France, and then go through the different factions of society where antisemitism is coming from, and maybe a little bit about sources, and finally, how can we assess it? What is the threat really? What we see for the next years even? What can we assess it? So if we have a look now, what's happening now in France? You're right. Antisemitism is nothing new to France. It has a long history, but new is since the year 2000. A lot of violent form of anti-Semitic incidents on the streets, an increase in general of anti-Semitic crimes, and this is a development where you can see a sharp rise from the 1990s to 2000 and ever since 2000. It's about 10 times as high as in the 1990s. Some years it's higher and some years it's a little bit less, but it's on a very high level since. what we can also see, I mean, that is nothing that is only specific to France. In other European countries, and not only European countries, there's also a rise of anti-Semitism. So in Belgium it's not much better. In well, all over Western Europe and Eastern Europe is sometimes a bit specific, depends very much on the country. So if we go to Hungary, it's different than in Poland, but this is not the issue for today. So when we say that, or I argue that there is a rise of anti-Semitism, what kind of indicators do we have? So we have these statistics that are done by the police, where we have this huge rise of the level of anti-Semitic incidents since 2000, since the year 2000. Then we can see that anti-Semitic tropes, stereotypes are used more often in public, in media. And we can also see that in our surveys that show that Jews do not feel secure in France, and there are very high numbers in France. 74% in 2012 responded in a survey by the European Union that they think that over the past 5 years anti-Semitism has increased a lot. So 3/4 of the Jews in France think that anti-Semitism has increased a lot in the past 5 years, and an additional 14% think it's increased a little. So the overwhelming majority of French Jews feel that there's a rising anti-Semitism. And you can see that also when you go into details in this survey, that many Jews now hide their identity. They avoid places of community centers or places of worship to because they feel that that's a threat against them. Or they even have some colleagues in Paris. If they go to Israel, they won't tell anybody because they fear that they get some negative attitudes there for this. So it can be on very different forms. The anti-Semitic resentment can show up in different forms. So it can be in physical violence, it can be in letters, it can be in desecration of cemeteries, can be attacks against synagogues, can be just in even an academic setting that people won't talk to you anymore, or these kind of things that happen, and apparently increasingly so over the last 15 years. We can also see...
Is anti-Semitism something that's spoken about within the community?
Oh yes,
Are there
the Jewish community, yes, and this goes into your question as well. The Jewish community in France is much more outspoken than, for example, in Britain. They address anti-Semitism much more openly. They not often don't get hurt, but especially in the early years, 2000 until 2006 or so. From 2000 to 2006, there was also a huge rise of anti-Semitic incidents, but they were not taken seriously by most politicians. But this has changed. But the Jewish communities in France, they address anti-Semitism. They're not too shy about it. I mean, there are always different views. They could do more, maybe. Yeah, and another factor where we can see that there's a rise of anti-Semitism is, of course, the jihadist terror attacks that target, as we've seen very recently, not only Jews, but Jews are a main target of terrorists, jihadist terrorists. We have seen that in And there we can also see a rise of an increase of the level of violence. So when we see already in 2006, when Ilan Halimi was abducted in near Paris and tortured for 3 weeks. He was abducted by a group called themselves the Barbarians, and he was abducted because he was a Jew, and this group, the Barbarians, thought when they abduct a Jew they can get a lot of ransom because Jews are rich. That was their reasoning, and they kept him in a basement of a huge building complex, and there were about more than 30 people who knew about it. So this was not something small, and that was over 3 weeks, and he eventually died of his wounds of torture. And it took a while for the police and the political establishment to say that this was an anti-Semitic incident. And we can even argue if they had seen this earlier, the police might have used a different tactic. Because they were always thinking that this group, the Barbarians, they really wanted their ransom, and they might not have taken into account seriously enough that they also wanted to torture and maybe kill the Jew, because that was in their ideology. And the leader of this group, he is an Islamist, and he argued in this way even when he was prosecuted. So that was one of the earlier incidents, and then you have 6 years later the shooting in Toulouse in a Jewish school. So Mohamed Merah went, after he killed French soldiers off duty, he went to a Jewish school and killed a teacher there and 3 small children. And this was very significant for the Jewish communities, not only in France, but all over Europe, because up to then, in the French school system, I mean, a very, very large majority of pupils, they go to public schools. But there's always the option for Jewish parents saying, if my children, there's too much hostility towards them in this public school because they're Jewish, we can always take them out and bring them to a Jewish school or a Catholic school. That's what happens as well very often. But that was not an option anymore. So that has a huge impact, I think, on the Jewish community, that the children are not safe anymore.
Why did they have an option to go to Jewish?
Well, they have the option, but they're not safe. They are targeted.
Oh.
They're targeted in the Jewish school as Jews.
And in the public school?
And the public school as Jews as well.
Awesome.
Yeah. There won't be, I mean, so far there haven't been terror attacks in the public school. So Jews are a special target for jihadists, and we know this from the Islamist ideology that antisemitism is a very important factor in this ideology. So it's no surprise, even though jihadists also target many other communities, and everybody, if you want, or everybody they think that doesn't agree with their radical interpretation of Islam. And then it was accelerated. It was in the Brussels incident. So there was another shooting in the Jewish Museum in Brussels that killed 4 people in 2014. And then, of course, in January this year, in Paris, the terrorist attack and murder, first against Charlie Hebdo, and then at this kosher supermarket in Paris. So that was again where Jews felt that they were especially targeted. And many felt that there were, it was true that a lot of French people showed solidarity after the Paris attacks in January, but the majority probably of French Jews sees that that the solidarity was not shown, or would not have been shown, if only Jews were targeted. Because in previous incidents, like in the Toulouse shootings, those who demonstrated and showed solidarity were only Jewish, well, mostly 90% or so, people from the Jewish community. So
There were a lot of Je suis Charlies, but not Je suis Juif.
yeah, that's another thing. But it's a general feeling, and this is also not only in France, that Jewish community feels left alone. So feels not enough solidarity among the mainstream population, among non-Jewish population. This is also true for Germany, by the way. After the summer of 2014, when there were a lot of pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas rallies even, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic incidents around these rallies. So you have this terror threat against Jews in particular, and then you also have this pro-Palestinian activism, and that has been going on for many years, of course. But in 2014 was a highlight where all over Europe there were many of these rallies, pro-Hamas rallies, often explicitly. And during these rallies or just afterwards, there were either anti-Semitic slogans or even action. In Paris, there was after one of these demonstrations, they targeted the synagogue and attacked the synagogue with worshippers in the synagogue, and we don't know what would have happened if they could have entered the synagogue, but blocked the entrance. So all this together, something what I forget in January 2014 was another big rally that brought together people from the far right, from banlieues, from Muslim communities, and from some of them from the far left as well. And they protested their anger against Hollande, the president, but they also shouted Jews out of France, and France is not yours, Jews. So there were very explicit anti-Semitic slogans that was a first for many, many years on the streets of Paris. So all this together shows us that there's an acceleration of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic incidents, violence. So we have to take this seriously, and now we're in a situation that the French Prime Minister, he sees it as a serious threat, not only for the Jewish communities, but also for France in general. But it's not sure that he can, that he has enough impact and he has enough supporters, even in his own political party, that address openly the problems. This has been something where I think academia can help a little bit in addressing the problems and naming the problems as they are. If we look on the on where all this antisemitism is coming from. So the worst physical threat, of course, are the jihadists who kill for their ideology, and this is has been in France often very difficult to name this as jihadism, as radical Islamism. That is a driving force there. That has become a little bit better in the last 2 or 3 years, that people would address and speak about the radicalization of Islamist groups. This is something that has been ignored over the last 50 years. Radical Islam or political Islam is not a new movement. That's comes, you can argue, with the foundation of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. But in Europe, after the Second World War, it has been supported by different European governments, directly or indirectly, and many of the Muslim organizations in France, but also in Germany and in Britain, have connections to Islamist organizations, and they get funding for educational work with young people, with in their mosques, and this has a long time been ignored and is still to some level ignored. So addressing the problem is
Funding
one
from the
thing.
governments, from the European governments?
Yeah, from France, from Germany, Britain, and often these Islamist groups or Muslim groups, they portray themselves as representatives and that of Muslims in this country, and they are not. That's what surveys show. They're not representative, but they pretend to be, and the governments look for a representative of the Muslims and then take that as representative, and so that is still a problem that has been tried to address by different French governments and also German and British governments. It's not easy because Islam is so diverse and there are different groups, and you cannot have one representative of all these groups.
But it seems like they don't even recognize the problem. If they won't name it,
Yeah.
then why would they?
That's right, that's another thing, that's right, yeah.
Very
So-
hard to name it because it's called names. If you name the problem, you're called an Islamophobe. So there's a huge amount
So-
of danger in naming anything.
If you
You're targeting all Muslims, etc.
So there was one survey that is very interesting. The study a year ago by Fondapol, and they surveyed the general population, also Muslims, and they surveyed or they asked people if they are sympathizers with the Front National, so the extreme right, or the Front de Gauche, the extreme left, and they asked them if they identify themselves as Muslim or not. And so they had a number of, as service to you, anti-Semitic statements, and asked if you agree or not agree. And there we can see that the level of anti-Semitism among Muslims is as high as among those of sympathizers of the Front National, even for many questions higher than that. That shows two things. It shows the Front National, the supporters of the Front National are still very anti-Semitic, even though Marine Le Pen, the current leader, tries to portray her party as not anti-Semitic or not as anti-Semitic as the party when it was led by the father. But you can see, for example, that 50% of these who will say they're sympathizers of the Front National think that, so 50%, the Jews have too much power in the economy and in the financial world. 51% both say that Jews have too much power in the media and Jews have too much power in politics. So half of them still have anti-Semitic beliefs among those from the far right. So this is another problem, of course, now with the elections, you might be aware of it, that the Front National is now the leading party in France. They do.
Because you're saying it was even higher among Muslims.
So now we come to the Muslims.
Okay.
So that is one thing, the far right, they're still anti-Semitic, and we should be aware of that. And the Jewish community in France is very much aware of that. They have called, representatives have called to boycott the Front National and to remember that this is an anti-Semitic party, so they don't want to be in alliance with that party. So let's come now to the Muslim population. Those who identify themselves as Muslim, they, for example, these the Jews have too much power in the economy and the financial world. There were 67% of those who identified as Muslim believe that. 67%. And for the other Jews have too much power in media, 61%, and the Jews have too much power in politics, 51%. So the numbers are also very high, and in fact, interestingly, for all the items that are not related to the Holocaust, they are higher among the Muslims than among the far right. So the far right has the highest approval to this question. The Jews use today their status of victimhood of the Nazi genocide during the Second World War for their own interests. That is 62% of the Holocaust sympathizers who believe that. Jews use their status of victimhood. That is not surprising because the far right is traditionally revisionist. So we can see that there's a strong feeling. But again, so we see that if we compare this to the general population, both the far right and those who identify as Muslims, they have, for most of the items, the level is twice as high as among the general population in approval of anti-Semitic statements. And then they did an interesting thing in this study. They differentiated between those who said we identify as Muslim by origin, or we are believing Muslims, or we are believing and practicing Muslims. So they made three groups. And those who were practicing and believing Muslims had much higher approval rates to anti-Semitic statements than those who were saying that we're just Muslim by origin. So this is often not acknowledged as much as well, that the factor of religiosity is a strong factor. So if you're Muslim and very religious, practicing, the likelihood is you're more likely to, statistically, to be anti-Semitic.
That's European Muslims.
That's in France, but this is also true for all of the surveys who made this distinction. Yes.
In the Arab countries too, or just
In the Arab countries, there are no surveys that have made this distinction. Yeah.
Because it would be interesting to see if it's a reflection of the radicalization of Islam in Europe versus more moderate in general in Arab countries.
Actually, I have a question related to what you just said. Because in the past, 10 years, 20 years ago, Morocco was considered to be relatively a moderate country.
Mm-hmm.
How come? Because I believe France, most of the Muslims are from North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, and maybe some Tunisia. How come when they come to France, they become more fanatics?
It's not true.
It's not true.
If you look on surveys in these countries, in Algeria,
Yes.
the anti-Semitic attitudes are much higher.
Really?
Yes.
Because I was wondering if you can have truthful polls in Algeria. But anyway, this.
That's true. But I mean, in surveys there are surveys that ask, for example, do you have a positive or negative attitude toward Jews? And in countries like Algeria and Morocco, they're about 90% they say have a negative attitude toward Jews.
Yeah, Algeria was considered to be relatively, on the leftist side, but Morocco was always considered to be relatively one of the most moderate countries.
Yeah, and it's still, I think. It's still, despite a lot of antisemitism. And in Morocco it's an interesting case. I mean, it had not so much to do with France, but indirectly. There is the only Arab country I know of where there's a civil society group fighting anti-Semitism that is not Jewish, or in general even in an Arab country. There's a group that, they have two organizations, but they're related. Yeah. And they do good work, so it is possible because the king allows it, and the king is more tolerant than dictators in other Arab countries.
And also, you have to acknowledge the histories are different
Absolutely.
in all of these places and countries.
Absolutely. But, I mean, there were 200,000 Jews in Morocco, and now there are, what, 1,000? 3,000? Yeah, so they're all left. Yeah. And, yeah, I mean, not all left because there was anti-Semitism, but many. Yeah.
I think they left because of the threat of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
A lot of them left because of that threat.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, it was relatively good life for Jews in Morocco. Relatively. There was still a lot of discrimination.
Since I think it was the summer of 2014 when Israel bombed Palestine, and that's when there were a lot of anti-Israel protests,
Absolutely,
and anti-Semitic protests at the same time. Has there been a correlation between anti-Semitic sentiment before that and after that?
Mm-hmm. So yes, when we look at the statistics when there are anti-Semitic incidents, it's true that whenever there is the conflict between Israel and Palestinians is very violent, then there are more incidents. But it's even in years where the conflict is relatively low, there's no war, it's still on a very high level. So there is a correlation there, absolutely. But there's also a correlation to other incidents. Not so much, but to, for example, the Toulouse killing, interestingly, the killing in the Jewish school, afterwards, months afterwards, there were much more anti-Semitic incidents. And not only in France, also in Britain. So this is, you might think that's paradox, but this is historically has often been the case. So if there's an anti-Semitic incident, many anti-Semites feel encouraged and do something. And we've seen also that the guy who did it, Mohammed Meha, he became a hero for many on Facebook, and so that was celebrated among some. And so there were others then who said, okay, we should do, apparently, so there's a correlation to the Middle East conflict, or the conflict between Israel and Palestinians, but also to other incidents. And that brings me to another topic, the anti-Zionism, what you addressed. So, and this is a complicated topic on many levels. For one thing, in France, negative views towards Israel is since the 60s, 67, when de Gaulle changed his policy towards the Arab world. He wanted to become friends with the Arab world and explicitly said, I think very open, prejudiced things, not only against Israel, but also against Jews. In his speech, I don't recall the exact words, but that was in 67, and changed his policy. And since then, gradually anti-Zionist has become so widespread that today Zionist is used as an insult. So if you want to label somebody, you say he's a Zionist. And this is a bit curious, I think, because why is that so that we can already speak of a demonization of Zionism? And it puts Jews in an awkward situation, because Jews are always suspected as being pro-Zionist. So either they declare that they are really against Zionists and become anti-Zionist themselves, maybe, or they are always suspected of being pro-Israel, pro-Zionist. And so this leads also to an alienation of Jews in general, because many of the Jews in France, and that's different to Jews in the US and true in Canada, they have relatives in Israel, because many of the Moroccans and Nigerians, some of them went to Israel and others went to France. So they have a close relation. Don't support everything what the Israeli government does, but Israel for them is not the worst place in the world, or the outcast of all the nations. They have rather positive feelings toward Israel and the people they know there. So there is a demonization of Israel that's been going on for the last 50 years, and that shows some effects today. And it shows also, one of the effects is that naming the problem becomes difficult, because some say, well, if there are anti-Semitic incidents, it's not really anti-Semitic, it's just an outrage against Israel. And this is, logically, it's a contradiction. Either it's anti-Semitic, and then it's prejudice, and it's irrational, or there's a reason for attacking somebody. But there is no reason for attacking Jews on the streets of Paris for whatever Israel does. So it's logically a contradiction, but it's so widespread that it's so often used publicly in comments about anti-Semitic incidents in the media, even among politicians, that people get away with this, even though it's a contradiction. Anyway, so that leads to an excuse of anti-Semitism and makes it difficult to address it. If you say, well, we cannot blame this all on Israel, that Jews in the synagogue get attacked. So there is they miss a step. They miss this generalization, of course, that in the mind of an anti-Semite, the Jews and Israel, it's all one. And so it doesn't matter if they attack one particular soldier who was maybe responsible for some mistreating of Palestinians, or if they attack a 3-year-old Jewish child in this school in Toulouse. But so this is something which makes it more complicated. We see now that with the terror threat against also the wider population, there are more politicians who do not buy into this logic anymore, that they take it more serious. But it's still open to see how that's going to develop. And there's one guy who I want to talk about before we should maybe discuss it more together. I don't know if you've heard about him, Dieudonné Mbala. He wanted to, I think he came even here. Didn't
He was
come?
going to come, I think.
He came a
and
couple
that
of
was
times.
cancelled?
He did come?
Yeah, they like him here.
So
The
he's
recent one was cancelled in the last
Recent
year.
one, but he came at least 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
the
yeah,
French
yeah.
papers were supporting him.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
others were very critical.
Mhm. So he's a stand-up comedian. He started his career even in a duo with a Jewish guy, and they were very successful and funny. But then at some point he did his own shows, and he became, since 2002 or something, more and more openly anti-Semitic. He wanted to make a film, he didn't get the funding for it, and then he blamed it on the Jews that he wouldn't get the funding for it. So it started off like this, and then he first campaigned against the far right, and then some years later he became a friend of the far rightist leader, and now he's even in alliance with Alain Soral, who is from the very far right, who even was kicked out or thought that the Front National is not right enough for him. So he is in alliance with this guy, and they have now together, I mean it's official alliance, they have together now another party. And one of their parties was the List Antisionist. So they said we have an anti-Zionist policy, probably, and they didn't attract many voters. So he became, from a comedian, a politician, and a businessman. He sells a lot of stuff over the internet that have, he uses always this, the label of humor, that he says, well, this is all just funny, so he invites Holocaust deniers to his shows. Forreston was invited in 2006 to one of his shows, and he has big audiences, like 5,000 people. He usually get 5,000 people together to come to his show. So he has forms of mocking the Holocaust. He has songs about the Shoah that mock the Holocaust. He has invented how would you call it, a gesture that resembles very much the Nazi salute. But he says, well, it's not a Nazi salute, it's just something that is against the establishment. La Canelle, he calls it.
Can you show it?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot, I wanted to show it on the
You can do it
pictures.
yourself. I mean, like.
No, I don't want to do
We'll
it.
see. We'll see if it is a Nazi salute.
I don't want to show it, but I can show around this.
Okay.
You can see it there. And you can see another one here.
That's all you need is a headline.
Yeah.
The Nazi salute is that way, right?
And that's not this more up. The arm is more
And
up.
it goes up here.
This,
here.
This
the,
is
no,
inverted.
the arm goes down.
Down, it's down. No, because I'm seeing he's holding his
No,
heart.
the-
So I'm just trying to see, so it's down.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't
The
know.
way it is, it's like a hand, one hand
Exactly.
towards the ground and one hand
Yeah.
on the shoulder. But the way he explains, like when he started
Listen.
using
Yeah.
it,
Okay,
It's
I
enough to show.
I feel that from Dieudonné, this is one of the things that people demonize him for,
It's
which
completely ignored.
actually lead to him
Yes.
being more reactionary.
Mhm.
Because originally it was, for him it was an anti-establishment sign. It just means I'm gonna put it up to here.
Yeah,
up your
but
ass,
yes,
right?
but then listen to his arguments then. He then said, and we do it, and many people who are his fans, they do it in front of Jewish institutions. So then he said,
Because he is anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Because he is.
That's right. And so he
because
said
is
the
anti-Semitic.
establishment, he said that's against the establishment, and he sees the Jews as the establishment. And this is classical anti-Semitic, classic anti-Semitic thinking. That he sees the Jews as represented, and not only represented, but they are the establishment. They are responsible for everything. They are responsible why he didn't get funding for his film, why he is banned now to play in some cities. It's always the Jews. They are behind everything. And so his anti-establishment thing, he uses it against Jews. And this is
Has there been an evolution of his use of it throughout his career, or
well, it's not only himself because it's his fan community. So his fans, for example, they post selfies in front of, the one photo is in front of the school in Toulouse, where there was this anti-Semitic incident. So, and they also put selfies in front of Auschwitz with this symbol. So what does that mean?
And
This
Jewish
symbol
cemeteries.
in front of Auschwitz, as if you take it seriously, this anti-establishment thing. What is the establishment in Auschwitz? So this only goes together in this far-right revisionist worldview that you think that the Jews used the Holocaust for their means for governing the world. Then it is Auschwitz is a symbol for the establishment. Otherwise, it would not make sense. So it's in this worldview. But he doesn't control, of course, all his fans. Yeah, but he uses it in his messages. He celebrates it. So you can buy the canal, and he gives prizes for the best selfie with the canal. And what he chooses then says something. So he doesn't distance himself from that at all. He endorses it. And so I think it is it has an anti-Semitic meaning, and his fans understand it that way as well. Yes, but maybe we can.
Do you have any thoughts about how,
One thing I
yes,
want to
go ahead.
give around. Or maybe not that, maybe afterwards. Sorry, yes, please go ahead.
do you have any thoughts about how French society, German society, Belgian society could bring these issues to the public, to publicize it more so that we don't have this situation where, there's this tremendous silence about anti-Semitism in Europe?
Yeah, it's silence. I mean, the political establishment the last 2 years in most European countries, they're not silent about it anymore because they realize it's a threat, and I think the reason for it is because they get every morning on their table, they get the security report, and they see the Jewish communities are targeted, and not only Jewish communities. So they take it for this. Manuel Valls is one example, but Merkel as well. She's not as good as Manuel Valls on these issues, but she's not bad in that. So the establishment, they address anti-Semitism, but not in the general population. That is still the case that there's not enough solidarity for the Jewish communities. Why is that? And one explanation is the anti-Zionism, that they that the hostile feelings against Israel are very strong in Europe, and that many people, even who are not fierce anti-Semites, for them, Jews and Israelis, there's not a big difference. So that's one thing, and that's one problem, of course, because I want to go into this like an assessment of threats, but that might become a bit too academic for this run, but I give it the run anyway. So if you want to assess, that is from this book. This has just come out.
Is there?
So yes, just let me finish this sentence. If you want to assess what is the threat of anti-Semitism, it's not only important what is the how strong are the anti-Semites, it's also important how strong are the anti-anti-Semites. How many people speak up, how much is tolerated, and this needs to be encouraged. And this is in the German society, but also non-Muslim. And if we want to go back to the Muslim communities that are in France, by the way, what the statistics show, responsible for at least half of the violent anti-Semitic incidents, and I don't speak about the terrorist attacks, half about the anti-Semitic violence on the streets of France. People with Muslim or Arab origin are responsible for these acts. That's what the police statistics show. But these are, we can then only estimate the real numbers. Often we don't know who the perpetrator was of one act. But they are a serious factor. So it has to be taken very seriously. So the anti-Semites also among Muslims are not enough. There are some who speak out against anti-Semitism, but in many of the established Muslim organizations, they are, I would say, even the majority of the established Muslim organizations who present themselves as representatives are influenced by Islamist organizations, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. So they would not speak out against anti-Semitism because they have anti-Semitic literature in their bookstores and disseminate anti-Semitism even in the mosque in Friday prayers.
9% of the Quran is Jew hatred, so if you just do counting, if you just go through the Quran. I've had very mixed students in religion, and I was teaching valuing and evaluating diversity. And I remember Muslim students saying that it took them years in Canada before they recognized that Jews were human. Because in their Islamic country where they grew up, Jews were subhuman.
Yeah, but the question is not only about the Quran.
No, but I'm just saying, every mosque has the Quran. So how can you, no mosque can be free of Jew-hating literature because it's in the Quran.
Yeah, but you can have the interpretations and say this we interpret today.
No, you
this
can't.
and-
Please, have you read it?
Yes, I have.
And you think you can interpret it as, cut off slice their throats and
Yeah,
stuff
but
like
you
that?
look at
Well,
Old
the way
Testament.
you can do
It's
it.
very different,
No.
because the Old Testament is descriptive and the Quran is prescriptive. Meaning the Old Testament says we did this,
Yeah, and
it
there's
happened, and the Quran is you must do this forever, this book is perfect.
There's another problem as well, that the Quran is seen as this is the direct word of God. So it's very difficult to do interpretation. But logically, you cannot read a text without interpreting it. And this is even more true for a text that was written 1400 years ago. This is a different context.
Also, I
So-
think, it seems like, obviously, I'm not an expert at all in Islam, but I know that, for example, in the Jewish tradition, there's the Old Testament, so there's the written law, and then there's the oral law, and you can't understand one without the other. And my understanding of Islam is that there's the written, and then there's the hadith, which are the interpretations, and I think that.
No, they're the sayings of they're not interpretations,
But-
they're other things that happened to Muhammad. And so,
But my point is, and again, because I'm not an expert, but my point is simply that it seems to me that it is a radicalization of Islam that this small constituency adheres to that causes the violence, but the majority of them don't ascribe to a radicalized interpretation, and so their moderate interpretation allows them to be.
actually most Muslims that I know often have not read the Quran, deny what's in the Quran, and don't go within 100 miles of the mosque if they can help it. So the way they stay Muslim is they've made up Islam in their heads. They haven't been there, and their parents didn't go to the mosque either. Their parents were Muslim, and they're Muslim, and they don't celebrate Ramadan. They don't do the fasting and stuff, but they're Muslim in the same way as they're Christmas tree Christians who have never been near a Bible, except maybe to use it as a doorstop. So, and so that's why, like he was saying, the most radical Muslims are the ones who go to mosques, because that's
Quran
where they
is-
get the religion.
Yeah, the Quran and of course the mainstream interpretation of the Quran are a problem. I acknowledge that.
Traditional interpretations.
Sorry, the tradition, yes. There are very few who say, I think you have here, Tarek Fatah, is he not from?
Yeah,
So,
he's good. He's
yeah.
basically throwing the corn in the garbage.
Sorry? What?
He's basically throwing the corn in the
Yeah,
garbage.
but
We've got to
he
revise it, we've got to throw it out and start
But
again.
he argues, saying, as a Muslim, I say this
Yes,
is
I know.
So he has an interpretation, and he has written this book, The Jew is Not My Enemy, so where he argues that. So I think it's possible, but it would be a huge reform within Islam to have a theology that is that accepts human rights. That's true. But if you then go and ask people and Muslims where the hatred of Jews comes from, the Quran is only a minor factor, because as you said, many don't go to read the Quran, but still they have anti-Semitic feelings. Still. So where's it coming from? So that's why I was very much interested into that. So I did a lot of interviews with young people who are not necessarily organized. I mean, those I interviewed were not organized in any radical organization. But still, the majority of them, they said they don't like Jews or they hate Jews. So why is that? So there were different factors, and the religious factors was only one of 4 main factors. So there was another one, like the traditional conspiracy theories, and Jews are rich and Jews run the world. That's one thing. They said, I don't like Jews because of that. Another thing was, it's just like this. I know it because everybody says so.
Yeah, that's my environment.
It's my environment. And interestingly, it's not only, it's increasingly not only like among Muslims. We have in schools in France today, and also in Germany, that the word Jew is an insult used in a school where there's not a single Jew. So
Today?
yes, today students or pupils insult each other as asshole and Jew. You're a Jew. There's not a Jew in the room, not a Jew in the entire school, but they insult each other as
Where is that, you said? In
Where?
what country?
in France and in Germany.
Ah, in France in the past, I mean, actually also in English used to be,
Yeah,
but in the past.
that's right.
One question, do you find a difference between Muslims if they are from Arab countries
Yes.
compared with
Yes.
Pakistan,
Yes.
Bangladesh and so
Yes.
forth?
From Pakistan, it's a bit difficult to say, but there are some surveys who look into that, like from Algeria and comparing Morocco. Morocco is less anti-Semitic than
Yeah.
Algeria. That confirms what you were saying earlier. Turkey and Arab Turkish and Arab backgrounds is also a difference there. Often
It changed a little bit.
yeah, it's changing now with
Yeah.
Erdogan.
Yeah.
That's right. And
But
many
from what
girls.
Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, the big countries from Asia.
That's right. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, there are a lot of anti-Semitic beliefs in Pakistan and among the Pakistani population.
Really? Because
It's-
Britain is mostly Muslim from Pakistan, isn't it?
Yeah, and Bangladesh and India.
Yeah.
And interesting, from Bangladesh a little bit less.
Mhm.
I don't know why. Why there's this difference between Bangladesh and Pakistan, I don't know enough about it, and they are not. Nobody has really studied it. There are some surveys that show it, but maybe it's just this one survey or 2 surveys. We don't know enough there. But the conspiracy theories are very widespread in Pakistan, and it's a recent development, the past 15 years or so.
15 years.
Yeah, 15, 20 years maybe. And I think that is due to the rise of Islamist groups that spread these ideas. I mean, the writing of Qutb and Maududi is in Pakistan is very well known inspiration. It's one of the first Islamist writers. Maududi, he wrote very anti-Semitic texts, not as outspoken as Qutb, but still. And you know that, I mean, we had this incident like 2 weeks ago here when the shooting was in the US, in some. Yes, and the girl, apparently she was radicalized in one of the madrasas in Pakistan by a school that is in this Islamist tradition that probably celebrate Mauludi. Yeah, I don't know exactly. Yeah. Interestingly, that the reasons the different Muslims in Europe give with this different background. So in Germany you have, most Muslims have a Turkish background. In France, Moroccan, Nigerian, Tunisian, so a Maghreb background. And in Britain, as you said, from Bangladesh, Pakistan and India. So the argumentations, the tropes are the same among these population. That was interesting to me. I would have expected more differences, but there was the same, more or less. And the level is difficult to compare really the level in different countries anyway. But we see it's a problem in these three countries among Muslims. There is one exception among these with Turkish background, the Alevis, not the Alevites we see in Syria. It's a different group from Turkey, and we don't know the exact numbers because they are discriminated in Turkey, against them as discrimination, and they have a very tolerant interpretation of Islam. So they have often gem houses where men and women celebrate together. They don't have these 5 columns of Islam that is often referred to as the essential of Islam. They don't do this. And among them, the anti-Semitism is much lower than others. And about 13 or 20% or so in Germany among
Turkish.
Turkish Muslims. Yeah.
Do we have statistics on Islamophobia in Jewish communities in France? And,
the Islamophobia, that's right. Was that, I interrupted you 10 minutes
No,
ago,
no,
so
no.
was that what you wanted to say, or was it something else?
It was along that line, yeah. Because
Yeah.
I have my friend, a good friend of mine's family. Of course, it's a bit anecdotal, but they're quite orthodox in their practice of Judaism, and I would definitely feel that they're quite Islamophobic in a lot of ways, and it's reflected in also their community and the people that they interact with daily. And my friend went with them to Israel to visit family, and amongst the people he met there, he said he felt that a lot of the Israelis felt that the French, because there's a lot of French Jews moving to Israel currently, they would definitely be further right on the Zionist political scale, even than people living, the majority of people living in Israel currently. So I was just wondering if we can also find that a certain distrust of Muslims in Jewish populations throughout Europe.
Probably so, I don't know. Probably so. But we should, I think we should be careful with using the word Islamophobia, because it mixes up many things together. So if like Charlie Hebdo is it an Islamophobic journal because they criticize and make fun of Islam and also Christians and Jews, and is that Islamophobic? Do we label everything that is criticism of a religion in the terms that we are saying that is a prejudice? Because if we use the word Islamophobe, we use it this is a negative thing.
Yeah.
It's a prejudice. So I think that mixes up a lot of things together. I think it's very important to be able to criticize religion. But often it goes beyond that. So some people have hatred for people just because they belong to a certain religion. And this, I think, is prejudice. And this should rightly be labeled, if you want. But I don't think that the word Islamophobia is good for that, because it mixes that up together. But, so, if then I assume that some of your friends or family, they generalize and say, have negative ideas
They'll
about
often
the
generalize
Muslims.
between Arab and Muslim. They'll put that together,
Yeah,
and all Arabs are Muslims, all Muslims are Arabs.
yeah, I mean, yeah.
And then they'll have a tendency to think that Arabs and Muslims hate Jews, which it seems like it's quite a correct opinion, statistically speaking. But also,
yes, but then again, the generalization that every Arab and every Muslim hates Jews is not only wrong if you say it in this terms. It's also not helpful if you think of getting into alliance with some people or identifying people who could help combating this stereotype. So, for example, one of the few Muslims who speak out against anti-Semitism in Germany among Muslims is Ahmed Mansour. He's a Palestinian, Arab Palestinian who grew up in Israel. So he has an Israeli passport, and he fights now anti-Semitism and also this idea of honor in families. And he's an Arab, he's a Muslim. So if we would label all these people as generally as anti-Semites, we would lose these people. Yeah.
I'd just like to share that I just came back from Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there, during the 10 days that I was there happened to be an interfaith Jewish, Christian, Muslim conference. And there were people from all three faiths who regularly get together and talk to each other and dialogue with each other. That's one thing. And then I met another woman who was an American who moved to Jerusalem, and she is finding the greatest satisfaction in volunteering in a school in Jerusalem that has Jewish kids and Arab kids in the same school. And then I met a third woman who does a lot of outreach towards Arabs living in Jerusalem. She's been living there for a few years. So I think there's a lot more interaction and a lot of positive things that are going on the ground, grassroots in Israel itself. Yeah.
But it's challenging, you're right. I mean, it's challenging because of experiences also that if you live in France and you're Orthodox Jew and you wear signs of Judaism and you go in certain areas, the chances are high that you get attacked or get some negative experiences there. So, and then often the perpetrators are of Arab or Muslim origin. So, and then it's not right to generalize it, but it's there's no excuse really. But it's this experience that makes it difficult.
It's also important to be able to know if 90% believe something, you have to acknowledge it. There are the 10%, you have to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But if there's
often,
90% here, that exists.
That's right, but there's another reason why, for example, I would not put a lot of work now for me personally to go now to interview Jews, what they think about this, and then oppose it. This is often what is done among politicians. They try to portray the problem as this is only a conflict between the Muslim and the Jewish community in France. But this is not the case, because there is no, there's no equivalent. It's not like Jews would now attack mosques. Or, there's no, it's not really about a conflict among two communities, between two communities. If you portray it in that way, you don't address really the problem. The problem is this irrational hatred. And this you can only address it when saying this is anti-Semitic, and it's not a conflict. Because if you portray it as a conflict, you say there are some reasons for conflict. And these are two communities, they are in conflict, and it's not our problem. They should somehow solve it. It's not our problem. And this is, I think, the wrong approach. And it's also with the wrong, addressing it in a wrong way. We see that after the recent attacks in Paris a month ago, it's not a coincidence that now the far right is so much on the rise, because they use, I think, the fact that many politicians, they don't address the problem that many French people feel, that radical Islam is a problem for a threat even for the life they want to live. So Islamism is not addressed as a problem, and from the far right they address this not as Islamism, they address it as the Muslims. And you can also see that in the US, Donald Trump says the Muslims should not come to the US. And so if the politicians, Obama is also a good case to study, he doesn't want to use the word Islamism. He says all this terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, and it's not Islamism, we don't know where it's coming from, but it's some I don't know, evilness or something.
Space aliens.
What do you say?
Space aliens.
Yeah, that's not the word he uses.
Random folks.
So
Workplace violence.
yeah, random folk was one thing, but that were targeted, and I think he used that when the kosher supermarket was attacked. So he doesn't want to address it. So then there come populists like Donald Trump up, and then they generalize it. And they are successful because other politicians, they don't address really the problem where it is. And you see that also in France, that the far right now, they are ahead in the elections there. And there's the strongest party now in France.
How would you see people addressing it without, because it's a delicate issue to address when you speak about Islam, but you don't want to speak about all of it, right? Because it's practiced in different ways by different people.
That's right.
And so I find it a natural reaction for a lot of Muslims who would feel maybe attacked when you address Islamism, because a lot of people would then generalize it as Islam.
Yeah, but we have the duty to look at it in detail. And I learned this 15 years ago in my university in Berlin. There was always, Hizb ut-Tahrir is a worldwide organization. They want the caliphate all over the world. And they have chapters in all European countries, and they have publications in different languages. And in my university in Berlin, they had an annual week of Islam, and nobody cared what they were doing. They got they were in the main hall of the university, big university with 30,000 students, and they were there. Nobody cared about it, but they had their anti-Semitic literature out there, and only one day the university cared. And why? Because they organized, that was in 2003, something on the Iraq war, and then the leaders of the far right came, the neo-Nazis came, and cheered them. And then it got a scandal, and they had to look more closely, what are they actually doing here? What is the ideology? And so, they got these rooms for free, and did every year. So we have to look into who are we facing? Because they do not do good, in general, to the university. University shouldn't be a place to spread hatred. And they do not do good to Muslims as well. Muslims, as I said, they don't see these groups as representative, and many of the Muslims who don't go to mosque, they would not like others to speak in their name, so they should not be funded. That's the first thing. So they still get funding, and they still are respected by the governments, and this should not be the case. So that would be the first step, and then say, okay, what is your ideology, and what do you preach, and if that's if that is against the law, even in some cases, I mean, they should be banned, or they should at least not be supported with money, with funding.
And if it's anti-Semitic and Mein Kampf is hate literature, well, what they're teaching is hate literature. And I think that is really important to look at content, what is in there.
Yeah.
But I just think it's very important to look at truth and to dare, and I know that one of the first things that happens if you do want to look at the Quran is you're told you're Islamophobic. I'm sorry, I did not write the Quran, I promise you. I'm pretty old, but I'm not old enough for 634 to have been writing the Quran. It's like, it's there, so you've just got to deal with it. And you have to have permission to deal with it and not be called names if you're reading it and you're reading it through and you're comparing things and you're saying, whoa, very nasty views of infidels in there. You know, when they call infidels, I don't call myself an infidel, an unbeliever, a dhimmi, an inferior, a kafir, a low scum.
Yes, but many of Muslims of your friends, for example,
Yeah.
they would not call you this.
Of course not, but
So
you know what?
there
My
is an
Muslim
acceptance.
friends are not devout. I don't have devout Quran quoting, or if they do, they quote, you know, a few of the nice passages and they don't want to look at the other stuff. But they're also, they don't call me names because they know I'm not against people, I'm against ideologies. And I think it's really important that you have permission to look at what is the ideology of different groups.
But that's anecdotal.
It's not anecdotal, the Quran is not anecdotal.
No, but the way that you're framing it, I find it extremely problematic.
I think you should read the Quran.
I do.
You
I
do?
have. And I also study Bible, and I know how it's been interpreted and what's in that. It could be read as an active statement, and people and rabbis have read it that way up to today in Israel, to call upon violence and things like that. So you have to be careful, I think, in how you're projecting onto another group.
But I am seeing behavior, and therefore I'm trying to understand, for example, jihad violence. So I'm not making them be violent. I'm like, where do they get their justification? Where does ISIS get their justification?
Right.
Why, when you find an ISIS cell, do you find dozens of Qurans?
But it's
all over the place?
radicalization. I mean,
No, but you, let's say the what are those sweepers, the Jains? You know those people go around sweeping the ground because they don't want to step on bugs. You know, no matter how radical the Jain would get, they are not going to be violent because all of their texts are so peaceful. Like you wear gauze in front of your nose so you don't swallow a bug. You go around with a broom so you don't step on a bug. No matter how radical you get, you know, you can go, and I can't even eat a microbe. But there's no way. So if one group or another goes more toward violence, I want to look at what's going on here.
But I would say that, like, you say that obviously you say that some people would nitpick parts of the Quran to justify it as non-violent, while other
Not
people
nitpick. I happen to have studied this in depth. Now Muhammad spent some time when he didn't get any followers, or very few. In 10 years or 13 years, he got like 100 followers. Then he was not preaching violence because he was small, and he was saying there's no violence in religion, there's no coercion in religion, because if anyone had coerced, they would have coerced him. Then he went somewhere else and he became violent. At that point, it was okay to be violent. So it's like it's important to understand. Like it's the only religion I've studied. By the way, I'm not religious of any religion because I haven't experienced religions as anything until recently.
Yeah, I mean, this is the mainstream. Even the Islamist groups today distance themselves from the Islamic State and the violence. So even those who preach hatred, they say no, this is a misinterpretation and the violence is not there. But we have the problem that the people from the Islamic State many of them, they know the Quran very, very well, and they use verses from the Quran to justify the hatred. So there is a connection to Islam or to interpretations of Islam, and that needs to be addressed. So there must be more condemnation, not only about the actual violence, but also about the incitement to violence, because this is what some of the organizations that condemn the violence, they still preach hatred against those who are non-Muslims or women or homosexuals, and this should not be accepted. I think this is one thing. And but first, before we go into it should not be accepted, I mean, they should not be supported. They still get support now from governments.
And governments are afraid of withdrawing it because, you know, there are people who can come and speak hatred against Jews, and come to Canada, etc., and speak hatred against Jews, but when somebody wants to, for example, like Robert Spencer, who really knows the Quran backward and forward and inside out, wants to come, it's very hard for him to get a speaking place. Or I remember when he came to Toronto, and I went to Toronto because he's really quite a knower. Down below, there were, whom did the CBC and CTV interview? Robert Spencer? No, they went and they interviewed only Muslim groups advertising themselves as Muslim groups, and they were saying Robert Spencer is a hate monger, he's an so and what got reported on the mainstream media, what was going downstairs, I went upstairs and I listened to Robert Spencer, I knew what his message is not about hatred, it's just about knowing, you have to know. And I'm really, you know, I've PhD and scholar, I believe in knowing. Like if I'm not allowed to know that the earth is round or
But I mean,
flat.
there is a debate there. I mean, I remember I read one of Robert Spencer's books, and
Which
for me, just to remember the cover, I don't remember the title.
Did Muhammad exist?
No, it was from 6 years ago or so.
That's
One of his first books, probably, on this issue. But I found that some of it was overgeneralization and essentialization of Muslims. And I think we have to be very careful not doing this.
I've never found that he generalized about Muslims.
Mm.
You know, he knows the Quran and the quotes and the hadiths and the sirah, etc. But I have read a lot of the stuff and I've never heard him generalize about Muslims. In fact, there's always a clear separation.
Mm-hmm.
Islam is an ideology. Some of it is political, some of it is religious. And Muslims are people. You can have atheist Muslims.
Yeah, but the problem is not Islam, it's Islamism. There's
No.
a difference. But the war on the terror that is going on is the war against radical Islam, not the war against Islam.
Okay, people like myself disagree, and one reason is that from the beginning, Muhammad was successful through violence. For example, there were 3 Jewish tribes in the second place. The first
Yeah,
one
but
let
this
go. No, but
doesn't matter,
from the
really.
beginning. So
Yes.
what I'm saying, that he wasn't an Islamist. He was an Islamic.
Okay, but if you look, for example, at at the time around the creation of the State of Israel, like even much before then in the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of, there were some Arab leaders that were actually calling for cooperation and living side by side, and it was Husseini, who was a radical cleric, and inspired, I think, by the Tube or the Muslim Brotherhood. Anyway, so he is the one who is the real anti-Semite, and he is the one who sort of started a different trend. But you can't. I think it's the issue at hand appears to be not Islam, but radical Islam. So, and that's
Hitler's best friend was the Grand Mufti of
Yes,
Jerusalem.
I'm aware.
So he is not
He
an
was not the best friend.
Islamist. No, I know. He was just an acquaintance. But
Yeah,
but
but
he was
the-
an Islamist, exactly.
why was he
The-
an Islamist as
no,
Muslim?
the
Why are you
difference
calling an
is-
Islamist as the bad Muslims?
Well,
that depends then on how we define it. For me, Islamism or political Islam is if somebody wants to establish the Sharia as his or her interpretation of Sharia as the law of the society,
But that's
and not
Islam.
a man-made law.
That's within
women-made law.
Islam, you're supposed
So
to have a
this is-
caliphate.
No, but you can
Well,
interpret it how you wish.
this is-
And it's a very small faction that actually believes that
This is
and wants to
until
instate
I
that.
mean the caliphate. No one wanted to recreate the caliphate until the 1820s, right? I mean,
Yeah.
1920s.
1920s.
Yeah, 1920s.
This was, I mean, there was a pre-modern society, so
But
and
not
they didn't
there,
have.
like-
Sorry, they didn't have nation states, and they didn't have states really. A caliphate is not, I mean, it's depends on how you do the definitions. But it's a pre-modern concept anyway, that was in Islam. And the Islamists, they try to modernize it, and they want a state that is run by Sharia, their interpretation of Sharia. And this is what I call Islamist, and this is what I would, I mean, I see that this would not it would not be possible to establish human rights, for example, and equality among the citizens of a state that is run by Sharia. So I think it's, and I agree with you, this is a wrong approach if we take it from the perspective of human rights, and it's not all equally right, different forms of living together. We want to, or at least I have my opinion, what I think is a better world, a better living together, and so human rights are one of these. Yeah, absolutely. So what Muhammad did 1300 years ago, didn't do. This is his thing. This is a historical figure. But what is important now in societies, how they want to live together, is what do they make of it? Do they take this as, eternally the ideal life? And this is what Islamists and others maybe do. They take the role of Muhammad as what we should aspire to.
Well,
And this is
1920
dangerous.
corner,
This is
that's
dangerous.
what you should do.
But in a historical figure, I mean, he was not the only one who was, to standards of today, cruel and bigoted, and this can be put in context. But this would demand a reform of Islam.
I
That
think
is
one
the need.
more question, and we got it, unfortunately.
Just, yeah,
I just want to put human rights above every religion.
okay.
Well, a secular society, yeah.
The surveys that you brought to our attention about the Muslims' attitude towards Jews as being highly anti-Semitic. I'm wondering, that's a prejudice, that's maybe based off of stereotype, their different exposure to any books about Jews, maybe they haven't met some things like that. But that's in a very different category than Islamists, or people that are going to go out and commit a terrorist act
Yeah,
against a
Absolutely.
Jewish school or
Yes.
something like that.
yes.
So, and I think to your point too, in the Jewish community, you can have sentiments of discrimination against Muslims, but the acting upon that is very far away from,
I agree.
right? So I think when we frame it like that, what can you say then about the percentage of anti-Semitic attitudes in the surveys?
I think this is a very crucial question, because attitudes, I mean, if you have an anti-Semitic thinking, that's just in the thinking, it's bad for yourself. For the anti-Semites, if it's only the thinking, that's because they don't understand the world. They think everything, they blame it on Jews, and they have a wrong perception of the world. And, but it only gets a social, a threat if they act upon the beliefs. Unfortunately, beliefs and attitudes and actions are correlated.
Mm-hmm.
But how?
How much?
How much and how? So this is something I try to put together here, and this is a more academic approach. And there are some people who try to see when can we really observe this connection. So one thing is how strong are attitudes. How can you measure that? It's
Right.
not easy how to measure it. How hateful are the attitudes? So if there's a genocidal intent, it's different than if you just think, okay, I don't know, this group of people, they are smelly, and I want to avoid them.
Why did you?
Sorry.
There's also a difference
They're not-
if a group has a violent, pro-violence culture. Because let's say on this side of the room we were very peaceful, but we hated people. On that side of the room, you were very unpeaceful and you hated people. Or the other way around, we're haters and we're also violent, and you're haters and you're not violent. So you go to each other and you kvetch about how awful, blah, 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 blah. And we, because we're violent, we'd go and we'd get some swords and guns or whatever it is, because we're violent. So I think, you know,
The culture as well, yes.
that the culture is really important.
That's
And what
right.
I'm thinking there is, in New York, there were a lot of problems in areas where there were Hasidic Jews and blacks living close together, and the government tried to explain it as in the two groups have a problem with each other. And the Jewish leader was saying, we're getting the kids beaten up all the time, and our kids aren't touching them. In other words, your point. It's not that the two groups, I don't mean that the Hasidic Jews had a better or worse opinion, but there was only one group that used violence.
So yes, yeah, I mean, we have to see into detail, but your point is correct, that we should make a distinction there and see what are the attitudes, what is the hostility, and is there, I think one crucial thing is the dehumanization and demonization. So if you do that, if you don't only think of somebody you don't want to be in contact with, but you demonize this group of people and dehumanize them, then the step of action and even killing is closer than if you just say, okay, I don't want to get in touch with them.
And a whole other side if you're prone to violence and things like that.
Absolutely. But then, yeah, absolutely. But it's also then a difference of you acted out on your own. So this is in my, what is it here? The second dimension here. Is it individual action that's also different, or is it organized action? Yeah, if you do it on your own, I mean, you can do a lot of damage, but if you get organized, you can do much more damage. And if you get it to a state that becomes, or that has an anti-Semitic policy, then it gets easily into catastrophe phase what we've seen with the Nazis. So the more powerful the anti-Semitic organizations are, the more dangerous they are, of course. So this is also another thing. What we see in France, that the establishment, they all condemn the anti-Semitic violence, and they do things about it. So there are about 10,000 soldiers now on the streets of France, and half of them they protect Jewish schools and community centers and kindergartens. So, and the other half they are in stations and public spaces. But I mean, this is also something. I mean, I went to so long ago to one Jewish kindergarten, and they have 3 heavily armed soldiers in front of the kindergarten, and then also inside the kindergarten. And when the children eat, they eat with the soldiers. I mean, they're kind and it's nice, but they're heavily armed soldiers and machine guns, and you don't necessarily want that for the whole time you have your children in kindergarten.
Those are
Shouldn't
sent
be the
by,
case.
those are sent by the government, or those are?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, to protect them.
You also don't feel like a citizen or better citizen.
Absolutely. It leads to the further alienation, but this is a measure that's unfortunately necessary, and they're paid by it, it's also expensive, right? So this is something that Jewish communities all over Europe struggle to pay for their for the security measures. it is very expensive, and many communities cannot afford it. But in France, they now, since a year, they have these soldiers to protect them. So, and this is the French government now. They want to. They do, I think, what they can to prevent anti-Semitic violence. They do a less good job in preventing anti-Semitic rhetoric, but it's also difficult to do it. Yeah.
I think you really have to, I taught ethics a lot, so you have to put in a really good priorities and ethics. So I remember hearing right after the Charlie Hebdo thing, there was supposed to be 1 minute of silence, and the Muslim students in many, many classes absolutely refused to be quiet for 1 minute. In other words, it was okay to do the murders, and you didn't commemorate the people who had been murdered with 1 minute of silence. And that is having been taught wrong values throughout.
Yeah, but I mean, it was, there were many of these incidents, but it was not the general thing.
No, but I'm not saying everyone and every, but I'm saying all the non-Muslims were silent. What was it that this group, let's say 1% of Muslims, the children had gotten an attitude that from at home, etc., that it was right. And so it's really important that you teach non-violence, that you teach respect right from pre-K on, that no child should think that it's okay or that your religion is more important than not being violent.
Well, it's not like I was
After
in,
this, we'll wrap up, but yeah.
I was in Paris during the attacks, and like it's not right not to respect the silence, obviously, but I also understand how, especially in France, a lot of Muslims feel persecuted by the establishment, by the French establishment, by the general population, how they feel that there's a huge amount of prejudice against them. And so when being Muslim is part of their identity, and when someone, like Charlie Hebdo did push the line, like in the US, what they would do would definitely not be viewed in the same light as how it was viewed in France. Such, like, it's a publication like that would never be published at a university like McGill. And
but they were not
I'm
published
not
at
so
the
sure
university.
about that.
They were not published at the university.
they wouldn't publish Charlie Hebdo's drawings here.
Yeah, I know, but Charlie Hebdo was but Charlie Hebdo was not
Yeah.
published at the university.
No, it wasn't. But I think like most publications wouldn't put it out and would risk the chance of being called Islamophobic if that's just the word I'm going to use.
Yeah,
instead
you
of-
see, Hebdo on I don't know,
Yeah,
Christianity, on
everything.
Judaism,
it's
on
not, but
politics,
the-
everything.
and I don't know how the Jewish community in France felt necessarily about how the Jewish face was represented in the
They ignore it.
Charlie
They
Hebdo.
don't
That's
care.
Charlie Hebdo.
But in France, the Muslim community is like it's
Because
one
you
more
cannot touch
thing
them.
that's on that people are
Mhm.
throwing on them, you know, and so a lot of young people who are already marginalized in so many ways, when you add that to it, it's really difficult for them. Like they see Arabs dying in the Arab world all the time
So
in the
it's every
news.
conflict.
True, but I can understand why they would feel like a need to work against the establishment and say, listen, we're not going to respect the minute of silence. And I think during this last attack in Paris, the sentiment was much different. During
No, to
the
me it's a much simpler answer. It's
Yeah.
what you were saying. They were dehumanizing the Jews and, demonizing them.
I think
So you don't stand silent if some of them have been killed because they're not human.
I think we'll give
That's
the
the
last
point that
word, we'll give the last word to the professor and we'll end on that note.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this interesting discussion here. One last thing about the French society, that is Pierre-André Taguieff. He is a sociologist.
Sociologist.
Sociologist. sociologist, a French sociologist, and he says today in France there are three different societies. There's one with what you might call the establishment, or those who succeed in their jobs and live mostly in Paris and in other bigger cities. And then there are many people living in the banlieues, not only Muslims, but they often don't have access to the same education, and maybe they don't want to have the same access, but it's a separate society. Language is even separate. And then there's a third part in the, what he says is the periphery, those who feel that they could become or part of the banlieues as well, and who live more in rural areas, and they are the electorate of the Front National often. So you have three different societies within France. That is his analysis, and then the anti-Semitic resentments, they play out differently in these three groups. So whereas in the banlieue there is this, what you said, this feeling, okay, they're all against us. They are, and it's true that if you come from the banlieue and you just, whatever your background is, if you send your CV and you have your address there in the banlieue, and everybody knows that this is the banlieue, well, the chances are not very high that they will invite you for an interview, because they know, okay, this is the area where all these guys live. They have their problems with crime and whatever, so we don't want these people here. So there is discrimination, not only racist discrimination or against Muslims maybe. Well, I would still argue that racist discrimination, so ethnic background, is more prevalent today than against Muslim background, but that's another discussion. But there's also against these areas. So they keep separated. And the feeling might be that there is all against them, but this generalization is wrong, and particularly if then they see that the Jews are representative of the establishment. But even Charlie Hebdo is not at all the establishment.
Mm.
Charlie Hebdo is very much against the establishment. It's a marginal little newspaper.
Almost bankrupt.
Yeah, well, now they...
No, not
they
anymore,
really-
but I mean,
yeah.
at the point,
Yeah,
they were at the
absolutely.
point of bankruptcy.
And and they were criticizing the establishment very harshly, but it was the French president and other politicians, of course, that this is not acceptable. That this is accepted freedom of speech, even if we don't like it, but it's not acceptable that there's terror against this newspaper. So it's all difficult to get it straight, because there's so much generalizations. But I think we cannot accept wrong generalizations, even if some might be discriminated against. This is not a good argument to accept wrong generalizations or anti-Semitic beliefs. So nobody should get away with it. That's.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the discussion. It was great.